Jatrabari, a hotspot of state killing during the July-August uprising, witnessed one of its deadliest days on August 5th, claiming at least 19 lives. Recently, a powerful film documenting the Jatrabari killings was released by the ITJP, Tech Global Institute, and the Outsider Movie Company. The film presents key evidence aimed at holding perpetrators accountable. Led by Yasmin Suka, the ITJP, with the help of local researchers, gathered crucial testimonies and footage. In an exclusive interview with the Daily Star, Yasmin Suka emphasizes the importance of exposing state violence and how transitional justice can drive accountability.
Last year, we were asked by some colleagues to begin doing some work on economic crimes and corruption in Bangladesh. And just as we began the discussions on which particular cases we wanted to have a look at, you had the protests which then broke out in Bangladesh. And in discussions with our colleagues over here, we then started to document what was happening during July and August, because it was really about being able, as these violations were unfolding, to begin to get an accurate picture of what was happening. And so we worked with, two groups of people. David Bergman, who is one of our researchers, pulled together a number of young people here in Bangladesh who were able to go around and to collect the testimonies of many of the victims from their families, and also to collect as much cell phone footage that was available. We began to look at how do we use the footage and the testimonies to really begin to deal with both what we call truth recovery, because it was very clear that for many of the families, they didn't really know. They saw on film and in the media what had happened to their children, to their husbands, to their daughters, but they didn't know about it firsthand. And we'd also heard that Bangladesh had set up this, revived really the International Crimes Tribunal. And so for us, the next best thing was about how do we actually ensure that the cell phone footage we collect is able to be entered into evidence for dealing with accountability purposes. Because, in the field of international criminal law, the question of digital technology and how you use that to ensure that, that evidence is admissible in a trial is very different to dealing with, old-fashioned ways of collecting evidence. You have to make sure that you authenticate the cell phone footage. You also, use new digital technologies of chronolocation and geolocation to begin to pinpoint, where the cell phone footage was taken place. And all that's part of the verification process. And so we, in fact, were able to secure the services of another partner who, did incredible work on documenting what happened in Sri Lanka, Callum McRae, and we asked him to put the cell phone footage together to give us a real sense of a progression of events and how they had unfolded. And we also wanted to look at, protests are a very difficult issue because it's also about how the security forces handle the protests. And what became increasingly clear as we began with the documentary was the way in which you had state-sponsored violence, because I think what was absolutely shocking and outrageous was the fact that, this was not panic action on the part of the police. This was quite orchestrated. It was planned, it was ordered, and obviously at the highest levels, because the way in which the police used live ammunition on protesters who were mainly civilians, who were unarmed, who had no real weapons, I think, except some of them were brandishing posters and sticks, but they were not in a position really to defend themselves. And I think neither did they expect the reaction that they got. There was no warning sign that the police were going to act in that way or to fire live ammunition. And so what we did is we, in fact, made two documentaries. The one deals with the incident at the Jatrabari police station, and the other one deals with a single incident of a young man, Ridoy Ali, who was also killed, and the circumstances around the brutality of his killing. And, as a result of putting the footage together, we got a very clear picture of atrocity crimes which were really being perpetrated, in our view, by the police, who obviously had to have received their orders at the highest level from the state. We wanted to ensure that we not only were in a position to hand these documentaries over to the tribunal, but we also wanted to have a public showing of it. We wanted the families of victims to be able to see it, so that, they would also see that there was not only a historical record, but that there was also an evidentiary record of what happened. And at that time, we also wanted to have, I think, further conversations about how much more usefully we could use the evidence. We met with the families of victims, and we've gone on to meet with officials really in the interim government, and many of the heads of these commissions that were established by Professor Yunus, and also meeting with civil society groups. And so that was really the point of the visit to Bangladesh, was to look at really what are the accountability opportunities. And it was very clear from the discussions that we had with the families of victims that what they were all looking at was criminal accountability. And, they wanted the perpetrators to be held accountable. And for many of them, it was just not enough to only deal with the people who had shot the protesters. They were very clear that they were looking at the head of state and politicians who were responsible, and particularly ministers who were involved in giving the orders that in fact the protesters should, the protest should be stopped, but in such a brutal way, by killing the protesters. We also met with the chief prosecutor of the tribunal, Tajul, and my two colleagues, Carlos Castrosana, who's a Spanish magistrate and prosecutor who's worked in many transitional justice contexts, and my other colleague, who is a Swiss policeman, who's been a key investigator in many post-conflict areas around the world. They did 2 days of training with the ICT's prosecutors and investigators, because obviously for them, the whole field of international criminal justice has changed a lot since the trials were conducted in Bangladesh many years ago. And so it was really bringing them up to speed on how you prove each element of a crime against humanity, and, to look at the conduct really of the security forces in what had happened. And we also had, a number of meetings with, I think, some of the new leadership. I guess you call them advisors and not ministers. And we met some of those student leaders who become advisors. We met with the chief law advisor, um, and really began to get a picture of how we could be helpful really to this cause of dealing with impunity in Bangladesh.
What was the reaction from the chief prosecutor, from the judges?
I think it was very positive. Um, and what was also very clear was that the prosecution and the investigations would need a lot of support, both technical capacity and, of course, the question of resources. They don't have, and I think the chief prosecutor was very clear at the launch yesterday of the documentaries that, what the ICT lacked was the access to the digital resources, which are necessary now to deal with prosecutions which rely on the new kind of digital technology. Now, I understand that another colleague from the UK, Toby Cadman, has been officially appointed as an advisor. But nevertheless, I think Bangladesh is going to need a lot of assistance because these kinds of trials are costly. The training is costly and it needs really the right bodies to be able to do that. And then, of course, the other thing is just getting access to the kind of technology and being able to ensure that the proper rules of evidence like chain of custody, the collection, preservation and archiving are done properly so that defense counsel will not be able to tear any case apart. I mean, that's the risk always when you're dealing with this kind of issue.
What you've done in the past, where you've served in truth and reconciliation commissions, and you've had a vast experience with that in various countries, including South Africa, where it all started. Are you sort of seeing the same kind of thing happening here?
I think it was not the main part of coming to Bangladesh or the main focus, but I mean, certainly when you look at a country that to some extent you've had an incredible moment in which a government fell and was forced out, you have to consider what the options are for understanding how it was that Bangladesh came to have such a repressive government. What were the factors, in the structural underpinnings of the state and its institutions, which allowed for this culture of impunity? Now, trials to some extent respond to what we call individual criminal responsibility, but they do not deal with what we call uncovering the truth about past abuses and understanding how those abuses were possible, how it was that institutions in fact became tainted and compromised so that it allowed these unjust governments which really perpetrated not only violence against individuals, but violence in that society as well. And I think that it has become, accepted in the world, given the number of experiences after the Second World War, that it is necessary to begin to look at these structural questions and the factors which give rise to violence. But in order to do that, you need to establish some kind of state commission which is able to uncover the truth about the past. And it's not necessarily, I think that there's a conflation in Bangladesh, and that may be because of the name of the South African Truth Commission. We would call this a truth recovery process, which is aimed at building a new narrative for the country around how it was possible for Bangladesh to have so many years of repressive governments, and how it was possible for this kind of institutionalized state-sponsored violence to happen. A truth commission will also allow you to look at the question of corruption, which is another big factor in many of our countries. So I don't see, truth commissions as being about reconciliation. I think that's a misunderstanding of what a truth commission is about. It is not about forgiving, because a state can't ask any individual family to forgive a perpetrator, and neither can it say to any society, you have to forget about what happened and we have to move on. That happens in repressive states where you have dictatorships that they say, there's only one narrative, and that is our narrative about what happened to us. And there's an unwillingness to engage in the fact that the state apparatus has been used to facilitate and promote one kind of national identity. And so a truth commission, in a way, begins to uncover how it was possible, how the state system worked. And if you look at what has happened in Bangladesh already, the fact that Professor Yunus established 6 commissions, one looking into how the media played a role in the ensuing years in the conflict that was taking place in Bangladesh, the fact that you have a constitutional commission that is looking at whether there need to be amendments to the constitution so that the notion of equality and the question of fundamental rights of all being guaranteed. Those those recommendations are already a form of looking into what happened in Bangladesh. And of course, you have the Corruption Commission, you have all of these other bodies. But you also have to look at the role that many government departments played. And that has been important in many countries. For instance, in mine, we looked at the role of the corporations. We looked at the role that labor played in maintaining a very important space to protect the rights of workers, irrespective of the race group they belong to, and how they took on the corporations to stop them from profiteering and, in fact, becoming an extension of the state's repression. We also looked at the role of the media, and very importantly, we looked at the role that different political parties had played over time and the role of the liberation movements, because it was really important to understand whether their policies had also given rise to violations. And that's when we discovered that, in fact, within the state in South Africa, within the apartheid state, you had parallel structures where decisions were being taken by, particular elements of the government. We had a state security council which operated and authorized clandestine operations, which set up and funded death squads in the country, which were allowed to take out people. And that is where lists of people's names and, operations were approved. And so the apartheid state, after 1980, we were able to prove that, in fact, they had become a criminal state responsible for state violence. Now, that is important because a truth commission will make recommendations. It will, in fact, firstly prepare a factual account of what happened during a particular period that you've had these repressive governments in power. It will look at the role of all of the different political parties. It will also look at the role that civil society has played, the media, and of course corporations, because often you find that there's a link between a violent state that commits human rights violations and of course economic crimes and corruption. And that is increasingly becoming a big feature because it also gives rise to this enormous inequality. I mean, in many of our countries, when you look at the huge levels of inequality, 10% of the population enjoys 80% of the benefits of the country, and the other 90% live below the breadline. And so those are questions I think one would need to deal with. And it's interesting, you know, South Africa, of course, was confronted with a very particular problem. We had a historical race and class division that went right back to the days of colonialism. And so we had a very polarized society that was based on race. One was black and one was white. But it was very clear that this was not where you could say to people, oh, go back to your own country. This was a country in which white people lived as well. And so President Mandela, who had spent so many years in jail, for him the obsession was really, how do you ensure that you create a society not in which people love each other, but where there's a fundamental contract that they put together and they agree to, which gives rise to a basis for them being able to live side by side without the fear that they're going to kill each other, because that was the reality of our time. And so for him, reconciliation was about the owning of responsibility for what had happened. It was about acknowledging the violations that had taken place, both to individuals and the violations of our society, the right to dignity, the right to equality, the right to freedom. And that could only happen after there was some expression of remorse and reparations, and only then could you begin to say that you have put together a basis for a new society to begin to live with each other. That was his conception of reconciliation. Sure. It was certainly not about forgiving and forgetting, because that is a very personal element, and no society can forget what happened to them. Forgetting is another way of these things recurring. And that is why when we talk about transitional justice, we talk about 4 pillars: the right to truth, not just for the individual, but for a society; the right to criminal accountability and to justice; the right to reparations; and the right to institutional reform and the guarantee of non-recurrence. And this includes, the question of memory, historical memory, and memorialization initiatives as well. So it's interesting, in Tunisia, for instance, when they set up a Truth Commission, they called it the Truth and Dignity Commission. In other countries, it has been called a Truth and Justice Commission. So truth commissions are not about reconciliation. And at the end of the day, there's a real question which I think the tribunal and the country will have to answer. How many trials can you have? Who are you going to put on trial? Because, by nature, criminal prosecutions are also fairly selective. Are you going to try the foot soldiers who are left in the country? I know that Bangladesh has talked about trying the leadership who have fled in absentia. Is, that going to solve the real question of how was it possible for her to have such a grip on power and to use the state's resources in a way which really impoverished the country? but also created so many violations in the country. And that's a question that I think the trials are not going to be able to answer. And it's also about having a national dialogue and a conversation about how do Bangladeshis find ways for them, each other really, to live with each other and to move forward with each other and to recognize really the pain and suffering of people, particularly at the bottom of the food pile. Because the one thing that is very clear is the class issue, like in many of our countries, is a huge issue in Bangladesh. And, you know, the privileged can escape from poverty, but what happens to the ordinary average person? And I think I understand that you have a huge population, and so the national conversation should be about what kind of platform do we build for a better future? Because understanding the past is not about creating a better past or changing what that past was about, but it is understanding it so you can build a foundation for a future Bangladesh, which is, I think, what was expressed as a vision by many of the students and many of, you know, the protesters. But, you know, Bangladesh is very polite. In having the conversation about the Truth Commission, they don't say to you that there's no way we want to talk about reconciliation. They just agree very politely that it's important. And it's afterwards when you unpack the conversation that you realize that there's such a misunderstanding that the conversation is about reconciliation, when really the conversation is about how do you unpack that past and ensure that everybody in the country understands and that they don't continue to live with the notion that my group was the one who was persecuted. Because when you have that kind of narrative and you think that it's only about what happened to you and not what happened to the other person, then the possibility of revenge and victor's justice, I think, can become quite a challenge going forward.
So a bit of a prickly issue is all the certain incidents that happened after August 5th, and there seems to be an attempt to sort of ignore that in terms of unraveling the truth and accountability. Don't you think that part has to be incorporated?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's a very important question.
I'm sure this has happened
in
many other countries.
Every country.
How do
You
you deal with that?
It's about, you know, we call that the temporal mandate of any structure that is set up to really look at what happened in the past. And often a symbolic sort of cutoff date is chosen. But what we found in many countries, including in my own, was that the violence continued throughout the negotiations. And so the Commission's mandate then changed from, you know, just looking at a date when the negotiations started, but really going right to the point when the president was, you know, after the elections, the president was inaugurated, and that was to ensure that, in fact, you took into account everything that happened up to that moment. And certainly, I mean, when you look at Bangladesh, I mean, those violations continued well after. And, you know, even after Sheikh Hasina left the country. And so one needs to be able to understand, how did that happen? Was she still giving instructions to people here well into the time that she had left? And so even though she may have formally had to run, at the end of the day, there were people who were still following her orders in the country. And I think that I saw, you know, another documentary of, I think, the violence in another area outside of Bangladesh. And it was very clear that arms had been given to civilians. And I can't really, I'm not so familiar with the names of places, but it was extremely violent. And the fact that I think they were counselors who had been given weapons, and yes, and they were
Outside where? Outside
Dhaka,
Dhaka.
outside Dhaka. Yeah.
Okay. So
I said this to our colleagues that they say that they've identified who some of these local councillors were. But that's another question. How would you prove that in evidence? Because they're wearing these helmets, which basically almost cover their faces. So what proof do you have that that is that particular person? And so one of the questions I was asking is, do you have I know you have biometric systems, but do you have facial recognition in Bangladesh? Because that would be a necessary tool to help you to look at, besides people telling you. I mean, obviously there are going to be people saying, oh, I know it was that particular person. But with the evidence of one person, you would need more than that to be able to confirm that somebody was the person actually shooting. So there are lots of those sorts of questions which come up. But the administration certainly was busy long after the 5th of August. And one should never draw an equivalence between what a state does and how people respond back. Because remember, people are responding from a point of deep oppression and also, I think, absolute astonishment that their own state can take up arms against them. I think that for me was probably the biggest factor in the retaliation. I mean, when you read the stories that we've documented, a mother saying to her son, I don't really want you to go to the protest, but if you have to go, be careful. Not knowing that she's never going to see him come back at home at night. You also, we have another case where I think a young man asked for his mother to make lemonade for him. And she said to him, but it's bad for your stomach so early in the morning. And so afterwards, when she learns about his death, she's devastated because, what do families think about? You think about the little things, the last conversations you've had. And, when you look at the fact, like when the phone calls start coming, somebody hasn't come home at night, you go and you start to search at the police stations, you ask their friends, and you can't find their bodies. Either in the morgue, you go to the hospital, and you see these pools of blood. I mean, the testimony was horrific. So from that perspective, you can understand that people take up action against those that they hold responsible. And that for me is also about, another gap that one has to deal with. And that is, do you have groups in a society that are able to mediate that kind of immediate rage that arises because of these incidents? And, while South Africa is no comparison with Bangladesh, we were acutely aware of the fact that the negotiated period was the period of the greatest violence, the single moment in which thousands of people died. And so we set up these peace committees so that you could also have an intelligence gathering of potential threats to communities across different parts of the countries. But you were also able to send in people who were trusted by communities, who could intervene and who could actually stop them from taking the law into their own hands. It didn't prevent retaliation completely, but you can never compare what the state has done with what citizens do, because the one is meant to protect and prevent and not in fact be the instigator and the perpetrator of violence. I think that is a very important issue. But at the same time, we also need to remember that policemen are also part of our society. They also have families. And so, finding out what happened to them is also important for them. That was a big question in my country, because even amongst the commissioners, when we discussed the question of reparations, some of my colleagues said white people, they don't need reparations. And we would say the big question is not whether your race or which group you belong to, but it is about whether or not you suffered a violation and whether in fact your dignity and your life was snapped out as well. Because, that's what we believe in, that everyone has the right to life. And while that right has been violated, like absolutely in Bangladesh, and when you look at the way in which the police behave, they certainly broke all the rules around the notion of protection, because that's their job, to protect civilians and the civilian population. But you can't ignore it. I mean, it was the story of the man who was hanged upside down.
Once you have all this evidence and truth, then what do you expect?
Some of it would come in the ICT trials, but not all of it. And that's why, the trials are not going to cover all of these issues, some of them. And that is why we are saying that, juxtaposed with that, like probably in a complementarity way, you need a truth recovery body which is able to collect a lot of this information and in fact to put that together.
I'm sure you've discussed this with people from the present government, this whole process and about having a commission. How have they received this?
Like I say, people are polite. And, the two words that come up, no forgiveness, no reconciliation. And that's understandable in the kind of violence that you've seen here in Bangladesh. And one then has to explain what it's about. But I think that obviously for most people, the most important thing at this point is criminal accountability. And that's okay. Because, in many countries, in fact, you have it the other way around. You have governments who don't want to deal with criminal accountability. And then they say, oh, you need peace first, and then you can have justice. And that can be an excuse for never, ever having to deal with accountability. And so I think that in this case, people are saying that justice is important. And, my responses to that has been, of course, justice is important, because you have to respond to what people want. But at the same time, as a government, you also have an obligation. And so you have to think about peace and justice, in fact, being mutually complementary to each other. They reinforce each other. And it should not be the one at the expense of the other. But that's going, this is just the start of conversations. It's going to take a lot of conversation. But, it was really interesting. One of the fathers of one of the young men that had been killed, he was interesting because he said, in his words, he was expressing exactly what we were saying, that you can, deal with, you can have a trial, but how are you going to change the system? How are you going to make sure that the same forces don't return, but with different faces? And he talked about the system needing, really real scrutiny and reform. And I mean, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but I think he was incredibly insightful, that you need to go beyond just the individual accountability. You have to really look at the bigger question of how do you build a new society on a new value system, actually.
Now that you've covered quite a bit here, and then you're going back, So what happens now?
Well, we have a meeting with our colleagues, the groups that we've been working on the ground with. And I think the question for us is, how can we be most useful? Um, you know, um, we have been in situations like, if you look at the work we've done in Sri Lanka, it has not been possible to get any form of domestic accountability in Sri Lanka because, in a sense, the government has never wanted to deal with the security forces or the different political regimes that made the killings possible. And there you have some of the worst atrocities that took place during the end of the war. And you also had atrocities take place in the 1980s, but targeted then against the people who are in government right now. And so we possess probably the biggest archive of evidence of, crimes in Sri Lanka. And the question has been how to use that. And so we brought, cases under universal jurisdiction in other countries, using their domestic laws, but their international responsibility around accountability. We've also used the evidence we have to sanction perpetrators. And in many cases, we've also done visa bans, not just for them and their immediate family members. And in the case of the former head of the army, General Shavendra Silva, neither he can travel or his wife or his children to the United States. In the case of the two former presidents, the two brothers, Mahinda and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, both of them were sanctioned in Canada. So neither they nor their children can travel to Canada, and any assets they have in these countries can be frozen. We've also had judges sanctioned. And the other area that we've worked on has been peacekeeping. For 1 year, we ensured that the Sri Lankan army couldn't participate in peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is seen as prestigious. Country earns money, the individuals earn money. And we, compel the UN peacekeeping to actually set up a vetting and screening process so that if you had been involved in violations in your own country, there's absolutely no way that you should be allowed to go to another country and do peacekeeping there. And already in Bangladesh, you have RAB, yes, in 2021. But if you think about it, you deploy both people from the police and the military. And so that's another important message to the country that you have to clean up. And these are some of the discussions we are having. We have some colleagues who've asked for us to assist with helping them around archiving their digital material. We have others who say you need to make more documentaries. We have the chief prosecutor saying you need to help us with the technology. But the one thing that is also a big issue is the death penalty. It is very clear from the discussions we've had with government that there's no way this government can afford to put a moratorium on the death penalty, and neither can they afford to abolish it. Just the way, the current population thinks. They want the death penalty. They're very clear about that. But in that, context, it becomes very difficult then for many countries to provide technical support and resources. And I think that's a discussion that will need to be taken forward.
Do you have any last thoughts? Where should we be going now that, elections are imminent?
The main thing is, I think, firstly, there are many families whose loved ones have not been put on this list of martyrs, and they have not therefore been given any recognition or any form of assistance. And I think that this foundation that has been set up needs to make sure that you have a list of victims, of particularly those who have died. And then I think another category is those who have been wounded and injured, because that's also very difficult for families who are very poor to live with without any assistance. So I think, one always needs to deal first with the question of the survivors and their families. I think the second is, of course, you've had 3 of the Commission's report, and the recommendations are very important. But those recommendations should also form the basis for a national conversation about how a new government will take that forward. Because I think that in many ways that's really important to the process of democratization in any society. And it's also about building a process that is inclusive and transparent. Because right now, I think inclusivity and the recognition of plurality is really an important aspect for Bangladesh. And then all I can say is I wish everybody well for the future.